Picture this. One of the most critical waterways on the planet, a narrow strip of ocean that carries roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil and gas supply, is barely moving. Ships that would normally be threading through it by the hundreds every single day are frozen in place. Insurance companies are refusing to cover transit. Shipping executives are telling their captains, "Stay out." The world's energy markets are in free fall, and at the center of it all, a 2-week ceasefire that nobody fully understands, a 10-point peace plan that exists in at least 3 different versions, and a geopolitical standoff that could go from fragile truce to full-scale war in the span of a single phone call. Welcome back to World Brief Daily. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz, the Iran ceasefire, and why the next 14 days may be the most consequential in the history of Middle East diplomacy. If you haven't subscribed to World Brief Daily yet, now is the perfect time. This is exactly the kind of story where you need daily updates, and we are watching this hour by hour. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single development. Let's start with the basics. What is the Strait of Hormuz, and why does the entire world care about it? The strait is a narrow choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, bordered on the north by Iran and on the south by Oman. At its narrowest point, it is only about 33 kilometers wide, and yet through this tiny corridor flows approximately 20% of global oil supplies and roughly 30% of the world's liquefied natural gas. It also carries a third of the planet's urea fertilizer exports. In other words, this is not a regional waterway. This is a global artery. If it is closed, energy prices spike worldwide. Fertilizer becomes scarce. Economies feel the pressure, and that is precisely why Iran has been using it as a weapon. Here's where the story gets complicated and honestly more dramatic than anything you'll see in a political thriller. The war that brought us here started on February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran. The operation, which the Pentagon later named Operation Epic Fury, targeted Iranian military infrastructure, nuclear facilities, and command networks. Within 40 days, the United States Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at a Pentagon press conference and declared, in his own words, a historic and overwhelming victory, claiming Iran had been rendered combat ineffective for years to come. But Iran did not simply absorb those blows and give up. It hit back hard, and the Strait of Hormuz became its most powerful countermove. TAN closed the strait, not completely, but effectively, choking the flow of oil through the waterway and sending energy markets into turmoil. West Texas Intermediate crude surged past $90 per barrel. Global shipping companies began routing around the strait entirely, some going the long way around the Cape of Good Hope rather than risk the corridor. Then on April 8th, something happened that almost nobody expected. President Trump announced a 2-week ceasefire. In his post on Truth Social, Trump wrote that the United States had met and exceeded all military objectives and was very far along on a definitive agreement for long-term peace with Iran. He said the ceasefire was conditional on Iran agreeing to, in his words, the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. He called Iran's submitted 10-point peace proposal a workable basis on which to negotiate, and he said nearly all points of contention had already been addressed. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt celebrated the announcement as, quote, a victory for the United States that President Trump and our incredible military made happen. She said the military campaign gave the administration the leverage needed to pursue tough negotiations and create, in her framing, an opening for a diplomatic solution and long-term peace. Iran's Supreme National Security Council confirmed the agreement almost immediately. But here is where things start to get complicated. Iran's statement released through Tasnim news agency, a semi-official outlet affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, claimed something very different from what the Americans were saying. According to Thiron, the deal included continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. The United States did not confirm that point at all. This is the pattern that has defined this entire ceasefire from the moment it was announced. Both sides claiming victory, both sides describing a different agreement and the rest of the world watching and wondering which version is true. Let's talk about the strait itself, because this is the most immediate test of whether this ceasefire actually means anything. Before the war, between 100 and 120 commercial vessels passed through the strait every single day, according to data from the maritime analytics firm Kepler. Tankers, bulk carriers, container ships, an endless convoy of global trade threading through a 33-kilometer passage. Since the ceasefire was announced, as of Thursday morning, fewer than a dozen vessels had passed, 6 cargo carriers, 1 oil tanker owned by a Chinese company, and 1 Gabon-flagged vessel called the MSG, carrying around 7,000 tons of Emirati fuel oil on its way to India, which became the first non-Iranian oil tanker to pass through after the truce. That is not a reopening. That is a trickle. Shipping company executives told CNN that uncertainty surrounding the agreement is making transit too risky right now. Iran is still in charge of the strait. Iranian authorities had not laid out any clear plan for safe passage, and when Iran did outline its conditions, they were striking. According to a regional official cited by the Associated Press, Throne intended to allow no more than 15 vessels per day and to charge tolls on ships transiting the waterway, with the toll revenue designated for reconstruction of Iran. Following the war, President Trump was not happy about the toll idea. He went on Truth Social to warn Iran directly not to charge tankers to traverse the strait, demanding it be opened, in his words, without limitation, including tolls. He complained publicly that Iran was doing a very poor job managing traffic. Defense Secretary Hegseth stood at a briefing and said flatly, "The strait is open." Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Caney, when pressed, said, "I believe so, based on the diplomatic negotiation. That hedging, I believe, so tells you everything you need to know about the level of certainty on the ground." And then things got worse. An Iranian news agency reported that oil tanker traffic through the strait had halted again hours after the first tankers were allowed to pass. The stated reason: Israel's strikes in Lebanon, which brings us to the second major crisis threatening to unravel everything. Here's where it gets truly complicated, because there is a war happening inside the ceasefire, and depending on who you ask, that war is either a complete violation of the agreement or has absolutely nothing to do with it. Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militant group based in southern Lebanon, has been firing rockets at Israel for weeks. This started almost immediately after the United States and Israel began their campaign against Iran. Hezbollah launched those attacks in solidarity with Thrawn. They are, in plain terms, Iran's most powerful and most expensive proxy. Iran has been funding Hezbollah for years, bankrolling its operations, its weapons, its salaries. When Iran goes to war, Hezbollah goes to war. That is the arrangement. Israel, for its part, responded, and the response that came on Wednesday was by any measure extraordinary. According to Lebanese health authorities, Israeli strikes across Lebanon on that day killed at least 254 people, with some reports citing the death toll at over 300. A single airstrike on an apartment building in Beirut killed over 200 civilians in an area where residents had received no warning to evacuate. More than 1,000 people were reported injured in that single day of strikes. Here's the detail that makes this so politically explosive. The strike was the largest of the entire 40-day war, larger than any previous action, and it came hours after a ceasefire was announced. European leaders immediately condemned the strikes. Iran called them a grave violation of the deal. And then came the central dispute that has put the entire ceasefire in jeopardy. Was Lebanon included in the ceasefire or wasn't it? Look at what President Trump wrote when he announced the deal. Lebanon is not mentioned, not once. Then look at the statement from Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, who has been the key mediator between the United States and Iran throughout these negotiations. In the third line of his statement, he explicitly wrote, "An immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon and elsewhere." That statement went out before any renewed fighting began. The Iranians immediately seized on the Pakistani statement. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps cited the strikes as justification for halting shipping through the strait again. Iranian officials began publicly questioning whether they should even show up to the planned negotiations. Vice President J.D. Vance pushed back. He told reporters directly, "I think this comes from a legitimate misunderstanding. I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case." He described Lebanon as a separate skirmish and said Iran would be dumb to let the negotiations collapse over it. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed with the American position. The ceasefire did not cover Lebanon. But according to sources cited by CNN, Trump himself called Netanyahu in a private phone call and asked him to be a little more low-key in Lebanon operations to avoid derailing the Iran talks. Netanyahu then announced publicly that Israel would pursue direct negotiations with Lebanon on disarming Hezbollah. A significant move, though one that came after the damage was already done. Meanwhile, a devastating picture of the human cost in Lebanon is emerging. David Meeband, the president of the International Rescue Committee, described the situation on the ground in stark terms. He spoke of anger in every direction. Anger at Hezbollah for dragging Lebanon into the war. Anger at Israel for the way it has conducted its campaign. Anger at America. Anger at European governments. He pointed out that his own organization had been forced to cut its Lebanon staff in half from 220 to 105 people because of funding cuts. He cited new research from the Center for Global Development, a respected think tank, showing that aid cuts over the past year have led to a 5% increase in global conflict levels. The Lebanese government itself does not support Hezbollah. The majority of the Lebanese population does not want this war. They are, as Meeband described, a silent emergency caught between a militant group they cannot expel, an Israeli military campaign they cannot stop, and a world that has cut the humanitarian aid they depend on. The death toll from Israeli strikes on Lebanon since the start of the war over 2,500 people. In Israel, from Hezbollah rocket fire, 23. Now let's get into what may be the single most confusing element of this entire situation, the 10-point peace plan, because there isn't one. There are 3. Vice President Vance spelled this out in a remarkably candid statement. According to him, the first version of the 10-point plan was submitted to U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. He said it was so poorly constructed that it was likely written by an AI chatbot, specifically naming ChatGPT, and that it was immediately rejected. It went in the garbage in Vance's own phrasing. The second version, Vance said, was the product of genuine back-and-forth negotiations between the two sides. It was more reasonable, reflected real diplomatic progress, and this is the document that President Trump was referring to when he described Iran's proposal as a workable basis on which to negotiate. The third version, and this is the one that has been driving confusion in the media, is a maximalist document that appeared on Iranian social media channels and public access television in Iran. It contains far more aggressive demands than the actual negotiating document. Vance criticized American media organizations by name for reporting on this third version as if it represented Iran's official negotiating position, calling the sourcing little more than a random Yahoo in Iran submitting material to local television. This is not just a communications problem, it is a window into the internal divisions inside Iran, a regime where different factions want completely different outcomes. And here's something important that gets lost in the geopolitical maneuvering. Iran is not a monolithic actor. It is a state with real internal fractures. You have the official government led by a supreme leader and a president which is committed to negotiating with the United States. You have the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a military political power structure that gained enormous influence during this war and whose senior commanders do not want the war to end. They have consolidated power. They have expanded their reach inside Iranian society. A peace deal threatens that. And then you have hardliners at the fringes who reject any negotiation with America entirely. Vance acknowledged this directly, noting that the U.S. had to figure out who actually held power inside Iran before they could negotiate with the right people. That is a harder problem than it sounds. The ceasefire is holding not because everyone in Tehran supports it, but because the faction that currently controls the top of the decision tree has decided for now that it serves their interests. This brings us to the Islamabad talks. Today, April 10th, a U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance, joined by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, is scheduled to meet with Iranian counterparts in Pakistan's capital, Pakistan Prime. Minister Shahbaz Sharif confirmed the location and called on both parties to come to Islamabad to further negotiate for a conclusive agreement. Iran has confirmed its participation. The White House confirmed the U.S. team. The talks will be watched with enormous intensity not only by Washington and Throne, but by every major economy in the world. Here is why. The Council on Foreign Relations published an assessment by Stephen A. Cook, their senior fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies. His view is sobering. He noted that there has been no regime change in Iran. The current leadership is no less radical than its predecessors. Iran retains the ability to destabilize its neighbors. And crucially, Iran now has leverage over the Strait of Hormuz that it simply did not have before the war began. I don't see how negotiations will change this reality, he told CFR. That is the fundamental strategic problem. The U.S. military campaign may have degraded Iran's conventional military capacity, but it handed Iran's leadership a new and powerful card, demonstrated willingness and ability to choke off global energy supplies. Tehran now knows it has a lever that even the most powerful military in the world cannot simply bomb away. Iran's supreme leader Mojtaba Kham made this explicit in a statement after the ceasefire. He said Iran would bring management of the Strait of Hormuz into a new phase. He said Iran will certainly punish the aggressors. He pledged to demand compensation for all the damages inflicted. And then in a remarkable line, he added, "We will certainly bring the management of the Strait of Hormuz into a new phase," repeating it for emphasis. This is not the language of a defeated nation accepting terms. This is the language of a government that believes it has gained more than it lost. Before we go further, if you've been finding this analysis valuable, make sure you're subscribed to World Brief Daily and have notifications turned on. We are updating this story daily, and the next 48 hours with the Islamabad talks underway could determine whether this ceasefire survives or collapses entirely. Now let's talk about the market reaction, because the economics of this story are staggering. When Trump announced the ceasefire on Tuesday night, the markets exploded. West Texas intermediate crude oil plunged 16% in a single session, settling at $9,441 per barrel. The Dow Jones had its best single day in over a year. S&P 500 futures suggested a 2% open the following morning. The relief was immediate and visceral. Investors had been pricing in the possibility of a prolonged war, potentially sending oil toward $120 or even $130 per barrel. But by Thursday, the euphoria was already fading. As doubts crept in about whether the strait was genuinely reopening, oil prices bounced back. WTI crude climbed back above $96 per barrel. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index opened down. Japan's Nikkei fell. South Korea's Kospi declined. The world's financial markets are watching every ship that enters or exits the Strait of Hormuz in real time, treating each vessel as a data point about whether this peace agreement is real. And there is a real-world energy cost to all of this. According to Tom Closa, chief energy advisor for Gulf Oil, it will take some time before any changes to Strait traffic are felt by American consumers at the pump. California, for context, imports roughly 75% of its crude oil, with nearly a third of that coming from the Middle East. The knock-on effects of a prolonged Hormuz disruption are not abstract. They show up in gas prices, in the cost of heating homes, in the price of plastic and fertilizer, and virtually every manufactured good. Gulf Cooperation Council member states are directly in the crossfire. Saudi Arabia's state news agency reported that the kingdom's east-west pipeline, a critical piece of infrastructure specifically designed to route oil to the Red Sea and bypass the Strait of Hormuz, was damaged in recent attacks. Kuwait accused Iran and its proxies of launching drone attacks on its territory on Thursday, even after the ceasefire. Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates also reported strikes in the days immediately surrounding the ceasefire announcement. Iran's IRGC denied launching any attacks since the truce began. There is also a broader diplomatic dimension to watch. A joint statement released by the leaders of Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Spain, the Netherlands, Canada, along with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa, called for rapid progress toward a substantive negotiated settlement. Their statement specifically included a call for the ceasefire to extend to Lebanon, aligning them with Iran's interpretation, not America's, and they pledged to contribute to ensuring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. South Korea, a key U.S. ally that hosts approximately 28,000 American troops and is deeply dependent on Middle Eastern oil, announced it would dispatch a special envoy to Thran to discuss safe passage for its vessels through the strait. Seoul appointed Chung Bong-ha, a former ambassador to Kuwait, as its special envoy following a direct call between Korean Foreign Minister Cho Hyun and Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Iran has even, according to some reports, suggested it placed sea mines in the waterway while offering alternative routing for the few ships currently transiting the strait. If accurate, that is not the behavior of a country that has fully opened the Strait of Hormuz. That is the behavior of a country that retains total operational control and is managing traffic on its own terms. To understand why Iran is behaving this way, defiant, in defeat, confident in negotiation, willing to hold the global energy market hostage even while signing a ceasefire. You have to understand where Iran came from, not just 1979 when the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah and established the current regime, but further back to the Qajar dynasty in the 19th century, to the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which divided Iran into spheres of foreign influence without Iranians having any say, to the 1953 CIA-backed coup that overthrew democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstalled a monarch, to decades of foreign interference, sanctions, isolation, and resentment that have shaped a governing philosophy defined above all by one principle. Never again will Iran allow an outside power to determine its fate. That context does not excuse Iran's actions, but it explains them. And in diplomacy, explanation is everything. You cannot negotiate with a country whose motivations you don't understand. Here is where we stand as of today. The ceasefire is holding. Barely no major U.S. strikes have resumed. Iran has not formally withdrawn from negotiations. The Islamabad talks are scheduled to begin today, April 10th, with Vice President Vance leading the American delegation. Iran has confirmed its participation. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif has set the table, but the strait is not meaningfully open. Only a handful of ships have transited. Iran is still asserting operational control. Sea mines may be present. Hezbollah is still firing rockets at Israel. Israel is still striking Lebanon. The death toll in Lebanon has surpassed 1,500, and inside Iran, powerful factions, particularly within the IRGC, are actively working against a peace deal. The 10-point plan at the center of these negotiations contains demands that the United States has not confirmed. According to Iranian state media, the plan includes a complete halt on aggression against Iran and its allies, continued Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz, lifting of U.S. sanctions, release of frozen Iranian assets, and withdrawal of U.S. forces from the region. President Trump, meanwhile, said firmly that Iran will not be permitted to enrich uranium and that all U.S. military personnel, ships, and aircraft will remain in position around Iran until a real agreement is reached and fully complied with. Those are not two positions that are close to each other. That is a gap that will require extraordinary diplomatic skill or extraordinary pressure to bridge. VP Vance was blunt about the stakes on the tarmac in Hungary before departing for Pakistan. The president is very, very clear the deal is a ceasefire, a negotiation. That's what we give. And what they give is that the straits are going to be reopened. If we don't see that happening, the president is not going to abide by our terms if the Iranians are not abiding by their terms. Trump himself has left no ambiguity about what happens if the deal falls apart. He wrote on Truth Social that all U.S. military assets remain in place in and around Iran, loading up and resting. And if terms are not met, in his own words, then the shooting starts bigger and better and stronger than anyone has ever seen before. That is the backdrop against which diplomats are sitting down in Islamabad today. 2 weeks, 14 days to turn a fragile truce into a durable agreement to resolve questions about uranium enrichment. The Strait of Hormuz, sanctions, frozen assets, proxy groups in Lebanon, questions that diplomats and scholars have been wrestling with for decades. The stakes could not be higher. A successful negotiation could end a war, stabilize oil markets, reduce the threat of nuclear proliferation, and establish a new framework for U.S.-Iran relations. A failure could mean a return to conflict on a scale that in Trump's own framing will be bigger than anything seen before. And sitting in the middle of all of it, the Strait of Hormuz, 33 kilometers of ocean, 1/5 of the world's oil, the narrow channel through which the fate of the Middle East may now be decided. We will, of course, keep you fully updated as these negotiations unfold. The Islamabad talks are happening today, and we will be reporting on every development the moment it happens. So make sure you are subscribed to World Brief Daily and have your notifications enabled, because this story moves fast and you do not want to be the last to know.